companies and to dismantle the federal government's ability to tackle climate change. Although this case is immediately devastating, not being able to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants clearly will increase warming and further fuel the climate crisis. This actually is just the tip of the iceberg of the right strategy to restrict climate action and a strong social safety net. But I do want to be really clear tonight that this case does still maintain much of the EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act. The case only restricts the EPA's authority under section, I mentioned it one more time, under section 11 of the Clean Air Act. But since the Clean Air Act is such a broad piece of legislation, it has many different components, which means that Biden and the EPA can be creative and use many other rules and statutes that are part of the Clean Air Act to redefine greenhouse gas emissions under various different statutes within it, different rules within the same piece of legislation that we have, to make sure that fossil fuel companies still have pollution controls and that they don't just get a free pass at total emissions and pollution. Right now, the Clean Air Act does regulate other criteria air pollutants that are coming from these power plants, but greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane that are particularly impactful in fueling climate change and warming are under a different rule that was restricted today. So the EPA and Biden can right now just integrate and redefine greenhouse gas emissions under other statutes. And we need that to happen immediately because as of today, there are no rules on the books that are keeping these emissions under control until the EPA and Biden take action to do so. So hopefully that made sense to everyone. It took me some time today to make sense of it, but I wanted to communicate it as clearly as possible. And what I think is powerful tonight that we're going to get into in the panel further is right now, I hope that this case can create a renewed sense of urgency for all of us and for Biden and Congress to use all of the power they have to, maintain their commitments and follow through on their commitments, to using Biden's executive authority to end the practice of leasing on public lands of waters, to stop the issuing of new permits for new fossil fuel infrastructure, to declare a climate emergency, to put more money towards the Defense Production Act, to scale up renewable energy. All of these things are still fully within Biden's control, and this SCOTUS case did not restrict them. So it's on us to make that very clear and to make sure that this only creates more urgency for the administration and for Congress, not less. And with that, I will pass it back to Varshini to take us into the discussion for the night.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. So my three takeaways from that are this ruling is immediately devastating to our communities because it limits our ability to limit greenhouse gases from a very specific part of the Clean Air Act. However, too, there are other parts of the Clean Air Act that can be explored and things that the EPA and Biden can do right now to define rules for controlling greenhouse gas emissions. And three, there is action that Biden can take right now using his executive authority to move the issue of climate forward. So thank you, Lauren. Really appreciate that overview and for muddling through all the legalese from today to explain that in crystal clear terms for us. I am now joined by a group of very awesome people who are going to talk to us a little bit about the ramifications of this, the moment that we are in, and the institutions that we have in the United States of America and what some of the consequences could be coming down the line. And so I want to introduce Meagan Hatcher-Mays. Meagan is the Director of Democracy Policy at Indivisible, which is a nationwide grassroots advocacy organization in DC, or is based in DC. And she focuses on all aspects of democracy reform, including reforming the judiciary. And so before joining Indivisible, Meagan served as counsel at Demand Justice, where she fought against the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, and was counsel for Eleanor Holmes Norton, the District of Columbia's non-voting delegate to Congress, and she worked on DC statehood, among other issues. Welcome, Meagan. So glad that you are here. And we have Guido Girgenti. Guido is the lead audio producer at Justice Democrats. He hosts a podcast called Block Party, which is about liberal left strategy in Congress with Waleed Shahid and Amira Hassan, also from Justice Democrats. And Guido and I edited a book called Winning the Green New Deal, which is an essay anthology. And he also serves on Sunrise's board of directors. And next we have Jade Begay, who is an Indigenous rights and climate policy expert and organizer. And Jade is the Climate Justice Director at Indian Collective and also serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Thanks for being here, Jade. And Aru Shiney-Ajay has been a youth climate campaigner for 6 years. She was one of the first volunteer members of Sunrise and later dropped out of college to run our mass training program. And Aru is now Deputy Campaign Director and most recently led our strategic design process to determine the next 5 years of our work. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Okay, so to kick things off, my first question, as we all know, this decision comes on the back of several pretty extreme Supreme Court decisions by a really right-leaning court, from overturning Roe v. Wade to the ruling that throws out gun restrictions to this ruling that happened today. Can you share a little bit more about how we got to this point? It didn't happen in the last few weeks. And can you give us a sense of that arc and what lessons movements should be taking away at this moment? Any of you can just hop off mute and start, and I'll kick it to you.
I'm happy to start. First of all, I'm really excited to be here and to be with you all. I know this has been a really difficult, I was going to say a really difficult week, but it's been a really difficult, 15 years. But I think it's really important to start thinking about the court a little bit differently than I think the left has traditionally thought about the court, and where we are and how we got to this moment. So this is, as has been mentioned, not something that happened overnight. We didn't just wake up and Roe v. Wade was overturned and the EPA was authority was gutted to regulate clean air. That didn't just happen in the last 6 months. This has been a 50-year project on the right to capture the courts and install conservative justices who were gonna do the thing that Republicans wanted them to do. And this all kind of started, I think a lot of people feel like it actually probably started as far back as Brown v. Board, but it really picked up steam after Roe v. Wade was, the Supreme Court issued their decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973. And basically the conservative movement looked around and thought, uh-oh, the Supreme Court is giving constitutional rights to Black people and people of color and women. That's not good. So they invented something called originalism, which is not a real thing. It's not in the Constitution. It's just something that they made up. They just needed a euphemism for we want to discriminate against women and people of color without having to say we want to discriminate against women and people of color. Although, side note, Donald Trump then came along and it turns out you can't actually do that and nobody cares. But that at the time, they thought it would be disrespectful. So they came up with originalism. They invented this group called the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is a right-leaning legal group that basically recruits conservative university students to go to law school and graduate law school and then become clerks for high-profile judges and Supreme Court justices, and then go on to be high-powered lawyers and then judges themselves. And so the main thing.
leave the night that we get back? Do you want to
Not everybody's muted,
like
by the way. So the main thing is they want to make sure, absolutely sure, that those judges were going to rule the way that they wanted, because they had had some high profile failures in the past where they had nominated justices to the Supreme Court that they thought were going to overturn Roe and, overturn like civil rights and constitutional rights, and they didn't do it. So they really hunkered down and they created a list of people who were sure bets to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that was the list that Donald Trump took on the campaign trail in 2016 of people that were for certain to vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Brett Kavanaugh was on that list. Amy Coney Barrett was on that list. Neil Gorsuch was on that list. And here we are. So this is a 50-year project. We really need to think about it in that context. So our response is also not going to happen overnight. There's no silver bullet that I can offer you this evening that is going to solve this problem by the end of July. This is, although on the flip of that, we also don't have 50 years to fix this problem. So what this does mean is that we have to be as dedicated to building back up what Republicans have torn down over the last 50 years. And we need to be more aggressive on this than the Democratic Party has been in the past, because I think we really took for granted that these rights were here to stay, and they're not. So all of this stuff is connected. Roe, the EPA case, the gun case, the voting rights cases that we've seen in the past, all of this stuff is connected, because what's happening is that the court is shutting down your avenues to respond with political consequences while rolling back rights that are really, really popular. So you can really draw a straight line from them gutting the Voting Rights Act in 2013 to where we are today. Because when they said, we don't need this anymore, when John Roberts said, things have changed dramatically in the South, we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. Like 24 hours later, Southern states were holding special legislative sessions to surgically target Black and voters of color to prevent them from voting. So I know that's a lot of information, but here's how it synthesizes into where we are today. So just over the last week, we got a bunch of opinions that say, hey, if you don't like it, go to fix the problem at the political level in your state. It's insulting for the Supreme Court to say that, knowing that they've ravaged the democratic process at the state level. They know how difficult it is for people to participate in democracy, and they know it's going to be really difficult to turn this around at the state level, where states have passed voter suppression laws and other laws to make it more difficult to vote. So our charge is to do everything we can to overcome these barriers that the Supreme Court itself have put in place, so that we can keep fighting for something better, because I still think it's possible, despite how many hits we got over the last 7 days or so.
Crystal clear, Meagan. Thank you for that long view. Super appreciate it. Pass it to anybody else who wants to chime in here. Jump in, folks.
I'll jump in. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and really excited to just debrief and hang out with you all. It's been a wild day, but just to build on what Meagan was sharing, which was an amazing overview of the last 5 decades. I really want to underscore the piece about, it's not just about Roe versus Wade. It's not just about the EPA ruling today, but this very strategic plan to just control and hold power. So as Meagan mentioned, this agenda also included the strategy where Republicans have stalled action on key bills during the Trump term, including voting rights for all, to really just preserve a system rooted in, again, the control and oppression of the people's voice, our voice. So, just combating a lot of, I think, the disillusionment around electoral work, that this is something that the GOP is coming for in a major way. And it is not necessarily, and no one's ever said that voting is the one and only solution, the silver bullet that's going to fix it all. But it's a key part of our, very diverse toolbox, or, toolbox or whatever you want to call it of strategies and tactics to change this and disrupt and interrupt this agenda that the GOP is very much moving. And I think we can all see it playing out over the past week and certainly today. So wanted to just underscore that, and then just bringing attention to, there is the GOP agenda that is underway, but there's been slowness and inaction in prioritizing climate legislation in Congress and in executive action. And so we also need to name that. And I know that we'll get into the weeds about how we can pressure POTUS and pressure Congress at this time to use the tools that they have access to so that we can achieve our climate justice goals.
Thanks, Jade. And I know, Aru, you were trying to get in there as well. Go for it, and then I'll move us to the next question.
Yeah, I'll just really appreciate Meagan and Jade, what you started us off with. I think just like one thing I want to highlight just from having been around the climate movement for a second is just the major role that fossil fuel executives, and in particular the Koch brothers, played in this entire strategy. It's, if you look back at who has spent the most money in ensuring the appointments of these justices, like Americans for Prosperity, the Koch funded group, spent I think over $1 million sending out mailers, calling people, trying to get them to support Brett Kavanaugh's appointment. They were also the group that spent, again, millions of dollars stopping a democracy rights bill from passing earlier this year. Over and over again, every time there's a reform to democracy or an attempted progressive changes to the country, to our legislation, you see the Koch brothers in particular weighing in, and it's very directly because they are afraid that they will lose profits and their ability to burn away our futures for their money. And yeah, it's just you can trace that back to the 1970s. So I think it's called a pincer strat. I don't know that much about this, but I think it's called a pincer strategy, where they basically play the game of both appointing hundreds of judges to all levels of court at the same time as actually being the people behind the cases that they are then sending up the court as well. So they've both bought out the judges and the judges have a lot of conflicts of interest, and they're the ones creating the case in the first place, and they're just on both sides. It's absolutely wild.
It is. I say to say one quick thing about that, because it is very wild. What's really disturbing about everything that Aru just laid out is that a lot of times we don't actually know who's funding the ads and everything that are promoting certain conservative Supreme Court justices to be confirmed to the court. So during Neil Gorsuch's confirmation process, somebody spent $20 million to help get him confirmed. No idea who it was. And we might never know who it was. We don't know where the money came from. And we know where it went to ads and things like that, but we don't know who spent the money. That's a problem, because it could be somebody with a case in front of the court who has funded that justice to be in that seat. The justice probably knows who it is, but we don't. And the American people don't know. And so Aru's totally right. The same lawyers for the same people who are putting millions and millions of dollars into these confirmation fights are arguing these cases in front of the court. And Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island has a really good report on it, which I will find while someone else is talking and put it in the chat.
Yeah, that was really helpful. And I think just the last thing I'll say in one sentence, sorry, Varsh, and then you can move us on, is just I think one of the things I'm most taking away from this, which Meagan was saying, is the commitment to long haul organizing and the commitment to seeing every single institution in this country as a site for being able to fight for power, and to it's every place, every institution, every school, every seat for judge, every office is somewhere where we must contest for power, and that is what they did that has led us to the situation we are now in.
Love that. Thanks, Aru. Yeah, that actually leads me really well into my next question, which is that, I think the decisions that have been happening over the last couple of weeks have been coming just at the very moment when people have rapidly decreasing trust in our institutions broadly, in the government in general, in our courts, when there have been really real threats to our democratic institutions that have been building for decades and that are manifesting in really ugly ways, is particularly in the last few years. And so, and maybe Guido, I know you've thought a lot about this, and this might, you could kick us off with this question, but what does a decision like this mean for our democratic institutions in the United States? And what does it mean, I guess, broadly for organizing and movements in general?
It's definitely bad news. But while I actually think that there is good news in the bad news, I really agree with Meagan and others who echoed that it's important to see this as the culmination of a 50-year project. I think, this decision really, there's been a lot of signals about how dangerous the American right wing is. I mean, January 6th should have been enough, but now, we have the courts and et cetera. However, I think we should be careful not to mistake danger for strength, because I think part of the right wing's weakness is they have exhausted the program that they set out to do 50 years ago. I mean, that's why we're in such a bad position. It's because they accomplished everything. But the flip side of that for them is that they don't have a positive vision of the future. And that's why they're relying more. That's why the strategy has flipped since Bush v. Gore really doubled down on the minority rule. Reagan is not a minority rule shit. That's a landslide win. Okay. But 2 decades later, the project is already weakened. And then for the past 2 decades, it's been like retrenching oneself into, capturing the Supreme Court. But we always have to remember that we're the majority, and they're very dangerous. But in part, they're increasingly dangerous because they are weak. Like, they're right. It is an existential threat. They don't want multiracial democracy, So what does this mean for the court? I mean, I think if we had better Democrats, I think it should be, it's an opening to kind of go beyond a politics of like, we have to maximize the best possible thing from a section of the Clean Air Act, which I'm happy that we were doing. But that is also like, they hate that Nixon made the EPA. They hate that. And they know that he did it because the New Deal order was powerful for 30 years. And it's been a whole project. I just want to rip it apart. So we have to build back from that. I'll just say one last thing about court decisions like this, because it just reminded me of this. When Roosevelt takes office in 1933, he has a recovery administration where he tries to get labor and business to negotiate, get the economy going, deal with prices. It doesn't work very well. 1934, there's tons of strikes. There are more left members elected to Congress, but FDR has a majority. By the beginning of 1935, things are really not going well in the National Recovery Administration. And, Roosevelt is just in a slump in terms of the first New Deal's programs. And it gets worse in May of that year when the Supreme Court comes out and just nail in the coffin says, actually, this thing has been unconstitutional. Kind of similar to this. You don't actually have the power from this bill to keep managing this. And what's amazing when I learned this is that what happens after the Supreme Court does that in May 1935 is it weirdly liberates FDR to just go back to being like, here are the reactionary motherfuckers trying to stop me. You know what? Let's just go for it. And the second New Deal, which is what we really know of, labor rights, Social Security Act, comes after the Supreme Court kills the National Recovery Administration. And the historian I was reading about this just emphasizes just how indicative of like what makes a presidency, what makes a politics reconstructive versus stagnant. It's like the agency to respond to a crisis of legitimacy with that kind of offense, not necessarily trying to save the court, but then moving to the next thing. So I don't think Joe Biden's going to do that anytime soon, but I think, we we probably have to prepare leaders to do that, and that's scary. So, but that's that.
Thanks, Guido. Anybody on the side of also what this means for our organizing more broadly? Curious, Aru or Jade, if y'all have any thoughts on that.
My hand is up. My name's Christina Hart, and I would like to.
Uh-oh. Sorry.
Oh, I think we're not taking questions right now, but are hoping to if we have time later.
Sorry about that.
Sure, I can
ahead.
jump in. Yeah. It seems like, is there a function for fielding questions just so that person can chime in later, maybe?
Yes.
I think, okay, great.
Figuring that
Someone
out right
will
now.
give instruction in the chat.
Yes.
But yeah, I think the question around what does this mean for organizing in general, that makes me want to pivot to talk about what this means for our communities, because ultimately this impacts our communities, right? And ultimately we want to rally our communities to work with us and build with us for achieving climate and environmental justice. So, this decision definitely has the potential to further destabilize the climate, like folks have mentioned, and also increase, if pollution and emissions go unchecked, then that has the potential to make impacts of climate change worse, such as more wildfire, more flooding, more permafrost loss, and of course, more extreme weather. And as we know, these impacts hurt Black and Brown communities and Indigenous peoples the worst. So, we're thinking of right now, how do we protect our communities in the face of this decision? How can we mobilize on the ground to create systems and networks that protect and keep our communities safe? Another thing that I'm thinking of and we're discussing is this intersection of, this is where the climate and environmental justice, these issues intersect with the pandemic. Many of our community members are family members as well. I'm sure many of us here on the call have compromised immune systems and respiratory systems due to COVID-19. And now this GOP-led SCOTUS wants to limit how we regulate, or the EPA's ability to regulate pollution. So making it that much harder for our communities to breathe and be healthy. It's already hard as it is. So this, this decision is, the impacts are hugely impactful as far as environmental justice goes, and thinking of those immediate effects. So those are some of the impacts. And, I think maybe the silver lining here, or there's no silver lining, it's bad news. But luckily we have the muscle memory of organizing during the pandemic, over the course of the pandemic, to do mutual aid, to do community organizing, to keep each other safe. So I'm thinking of, what are the things that we can be doing on the community level to ensure that our elders have access to air filtration, air filters, air purifiers? What are we doing to check on our community members to make sure that they're safe and breathing well? So I think, what this means is that we have to be thinking at that level of organizing, as well as, and I see in the chat lots of folks talking about the electoral work that we need to be doing as well. So I think we're just going to come up to this this call to action again and again on this call, just that we need to continue to organize forward. This does not mean that we've lost in any way. It means that we just need to working as a united front, more stronger as a united front, and and yeah, bringing back that muscle memory that we gained as far as being in the pandemic and learning how to take care of each other on a community level.
Totally. I think that's a really important point of how do we engage in creative local organizing that is taking care of people right now while we continue to build the building blocks for the next 50 years that talks about how we actually improve our institutions and put people in power, but also like we need to support people who need abortions right now. And we need to support people who are suffering from pollution right now and thinking about that creatively all at once. I love that. Yeah, Ru?
Yeah, thanks, Varsh. I think really echo that, Jade. I think one of the things that I've been like quite honestly wrestling with is, I mean, the Supreme Court has just showed itself to be a deeply partisan and politicized institution, and it is no longer true that they can like claim this veneer of being like above the fray, which is what they've claimed for a long time. And in some ways that's like exposing them for what they are, and in other ways it's like kind of wild. But I just remember being in like 5th grade and learning about like the 3 branches of government and like learning about the Supreme Court. I just like would never have imagined we would be in this moment where so many people are questioning the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and actually questioning the power of the government in general. It's like it's a very new moment for me, and I think for a lot of us. And I think some top line reflections I have there is like, one, like I think I'm really reckoning with the fact that we need extremely serious democratic reforms if we are to stop climate change or to win a lot of the really ambitious, like a Green New Deal, about like racial justice, like a lot of these visions that we have will need serious democratic reform in order for us to actually see them through. And I'll be honest, like I feel like I don't know exactly what that democratic reform looks like. Like, does it look like just abolishing the filibuster? Is it like the Senate is an arcane institution? Is it like pack the courts? Is it like term limit? Like, what is it more? All of the above and more? I'm not entirely, like probably all of the above and more is the answer. But it becomes extremely clear that is necessary. And I think the thing I would add to that is I'm like, there are two things, or from my view as like a Green New Deal organizer, the climate crisis is like real and hurtling towards us, and it's here already, and it is like tangible. Our democratic institutions are things that we have constructed, and they are malleable and they can change. The climate crisis will happen no matter what. That is the thing that that is the thing that we like need to work our democracy around, rather than being like, oh, we can't stop climate change because the Senate won't work for it. So yeah, just to be like, I think that's one thing I'm thinking. And then I think the other thing that Guido said is just like, I, in some ways, am really reckoning with the fact that the Supreme Court is representative of a very small and elite minority, and the majority of people in this country do not agree with the decisions that it is making. And that is in some ways reassuring, because I'm like, I actually think that the most of this country will choose to go in a different direction. And in some ways really wild that we are moving towards a moment where like the people in power and the rest of the people in the country are just pulling like that.
I say a quick thing about something Aru said, because I know the answer to one of the questions that Aru said, what is how you fix this problem? But also I think it's related to your question, Varshini, about how this changes organizing for folks. So a few things I wanted to say. One, I loved what Guido said. I think that was all exactly right. I think it's interesting that we're in a situation now where the president is saying, well, I don't want to make any radical, quote unquote, radical moves because I don't want to undermine the public's trust in the Supreme Court. Here we have the least popular Supreme Court ever, and he's concerned about undermining public trust in the Supreme Court. The least radical thing we could do in this moment is add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. That's a very moderate reform, actually, given the absolute like savagery of the last week of these opinions, which are going to cause real harm and possibly death to people. That is radical. Saying that you can have guns wherever, states can't regulate concealed carry unless there's a historical analog for the regulation, saying that the EPA doesn't really have the authority to protect the environment, saying that there is no constitutional right to an abortion, which, by the way, attacks the legal underpinnings that guarantees us the right to access contraception, to have same-sex marriages, to have just same-sex relationships, period. All of that was attacked over the last week. That's radical. What's not radical is to say, I don't want to be governed by these people who were voted, or who were confirmed, by senators who represent like less than 40% of the country as a whole. That's not radical. That's not a radical response. So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing is, I think the way that this changes organizing is that it means that the court really has to become a central part of our message to folks that we organize with, because the court is so interwoven into everything that we care about, every single issue that animates us and like brings us to this movement, whether that's climate, democracy, reproductive rights. Of course, these things are all connected, but whatever it is that really animates you to be in this moment, the Supreme Court is hostile to it. So the court has to be a part of that conversation. And I think the analog is the filibuster, where when we all first started talking about getting rid of the filibuster 3 years ago, a lot of our friends in the movement and a lot of members of Congress didn't want us to do that. They were like, no, that's too radical. Don't talk about getting rid of the filibuster. It's going to turn people off and we're going to lose the election. And it's not true. What we did was we educated folks about what was going on. What was the thing that was blocking you from getting the bill you wanted passed? And the answer is the filibuster. Now you cannot run as a Democrat for Senate and support the filibuster as a rule. Not even Connor Lamb was like, yeah, it would get rid of the filibuster. And he's not a progressive by any stretch of the imagination. Court reform can be that also, but like that has to be a part of our organizing strategy too. That if we want to pass a slate of voting rights reforms, if we want to pass climate change legislation, if we want to codify Roe at the federal level, then you have to fix the court. Otherwise you lose those things again. So that I think really fundamentally shifts how we're talking to folks and what we're talking to them about, while, and I cannot agree more with Varshini and Jade, that we're helping people in this moment as we plan our long-term response to these, the damage that the Supreme Court and the Republicans have done.
Totally. Thank you all very much. I'm seeing some questions that are starting to come in. If folks have questions that you would like our panelists to help answer, you can drop them into the chat, and Deirdre from our team is capturing them, and we'll get through as many as we can. There is one that just came in that is very related to what you just said, Meagan. And someone is asking, is it possible for Biden or Congress to add justices to the court? How is this not even in the public discussion? What's going on? Can you expand a little bit more on what you just said and maybe break that down for people?
Yeah, you can add seats. It's happened 7 times in the past. Most recently, de facto, we dropped down to 8 because Mitch McConnell held open Scalia's seat, for a year so that Donald Trump could fill it with Neil Gorsuch. Remember him? So it's been lots of different sizes. In the past, it's usually linked to the number of federal circuits there are in the country. So there used to be like 6 federal circuits. So there were 6 justices. Then there were 9. So then there were 9 justices. There are 13 circuits now. So something to think about. That's one reason why has expanded in the past. The second reason I think is actually more relevant to the times we find ourselves in now, which is when Lincoln expanded the court, because he had a bunch of he had some justices on the Supreme Court who were sympathetic to the South's argument in the Civil War. They were on the Southern side of the Civil War. And he thought, I cannot have people in control of the Supreme Court who want to tear this democracy apart. Sound familiar? So that's kind of like where we are right now. So there's 2 arguments. One is like sort of value neutral. There are 13 circuits, there should be 13 justices. The other is the Supreme Court is an existential threat to our democracy, and those people cannot be in charge of determining whether or how we participate in this democracy if they themselves are hostile to it. So that's kind of been the historical case for expansion in the past. This can be done, by the way, with simple legislation. I say simple because it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. It would just go through the regular process. You would, yes, need to get rid of the filibuster to pass it, and you would need every Democrat to support it, which we don't have. We have 3 senators on the bill on the Senate side: Ed Markey, Tina Smith, and Elizabeth Warren. If you live in a state that is not Massachusetts or Minnesota, the best thing you can do is call your senator and ask them to co-sponsor this bill, because our rights are under attack. They are not going to stop with the Clean Air Act, because they've already agreed to take up a case in the fall about the Clean Water Act. So they're not going to stop at this. They're not going to stop with abortion. They're not going to stop with concealed carry. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse until Congress does something about it. So that can all be done through simple legislation. It doesn't need a constitutional amendment. Term limits are a little bit trickier. I won't digress too much into it. I think it's possible to do it through legislation, but the most, if you take one thing away from what I say tonight, the most important court reform that we can pursue is expansion. Other reforms are important too. They can move along with expansion, but unless you do something to immediately address the problem we're facing right now, the other reforms don't matter as much. So term limits wouldn't kick in for decades into the future. They wouldn't apply to the current justices. That's not going to work for the problems we're facing right now. It's a good reform for the long term. So in the meantime, as we're organizing, as we're fighting to build our majorities, expand our power in Congress, that's what we should be looking for, is Democrats who are fighters, not just for voting rights, but for fixing the court also.
Thank you. I have one question from me, which is, I think the question that I've been sort of wrestling with the most as someone who works on this issue a lot is just, what does this mean for the ability of the federal government to regulate climate change? I mean, we know that the federal government is, one of the most important tools that we have to be able to move at this scale and speed that is required to prevent climate catastrophe. What does it actually mean for the ability of our federal government to regulate climate change, and what are some concrete things that we can do? I know Lauren mentioned some of that, but if folks could elaborate, that would be great.
I'll just give a big picture response to that, which is, SCOTUS is definitely giving us the finger by being like, hey, you got to pass a new law if you want to do something. Like right after Joe Biden's power sector rule has failed. But yeah, even before this SCOTUS ruling, it was really disheartening and, honestly radicalizing to see in some ways how overdetermined the defeats of the initial Biden climate plan was in the legislative process. There was no way a new law was going to be passed once you're doing budget reconciliation, and then there's no way you're going to do a rule, and then SCOTUS is going to tell you to do EPA. So I don't know. It forced me to take a step back and say, yes, the federal government is a huge tool, and the public sector is a huge tool. But we don't have a public sector, and that's why when there's a plague, people just die, and that's intentional. The neoliberals gutted it, and they went part by part, and they finally got to the EPA. And so it just, it makes me feel like that, we're not just going to get into the Department of Energy and there's 1,000 GND engineers ready to build solar panels. That's our generational project. And I think that relates honestly to the constitutional issues, because at a certain point, if the constitutional system is falling apart, if I'm a Green New Dealer, what I'm doing is I'm great, here's my new Green New Deal constitutionalism. The US Constitution is a pre-modern document, and it's not a secret. When liberal diplomats from the US go help South Africa write their constitution after the fall of apartheid, they're don't look at ours. Ours is really prone to falling apart. It's really easy to have a constitutional crisis in this divided government. So, we don't know how history will go down, but we need to find a way to rebuild the public sector. And I don't know that we're going to tweak the current constitutional order and get there.
All right. Well, we are just about wrapping up. If everyone could give some love in the chat for our incredible panelists. I learned so much from all of you today. It was really fun to listen to you on a very difficult day. So that's quite a feat in and of itself. Thank you. And just thank you for your insight. Thank you for your continued fight and for giving us all a little bit of direction and clarity here. And we are very, very grateful to you. So don't go just yet. I have a couple minutes of stuff I want to share with you. And I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us as well. I feel very much in it with you about what it is like to be young at a time when everything that we were told about how our country should work is falling apart around us. Not that a lot of it was working when they told us that, but it's falling apart even worse. And it's really terrifying and ungrounding. And it's really clear to me that, while our future is uncertain, and I think the world is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better, exactly what the polluters and the bullies and the capitalists want most in the world is for us to feel small and to hang our heads and to go home and to say that it cannot be done. So I refuse to give them the satisfaction. And I hope that you refuse to give them the satisfaction. And we are at the logical conclusion of a decades-long scheme by the right to accumulate power and make their deeply unpopular ideas the law of the land. And now our generation is going to step up and take our place in history to stem the violence and the regression and to build a more vibrant and hopeful future. And so if you are interested in doing something to make it clear to the country that young people will not just casually accept the life-threatening rulings of an illegitimate Supreme Court, there's something that you can do. So there's a group of movement leaders and partners across different issue areas who have been talking about what it would look like to take action, to expose the Supreme Court as the broken institution that it is. We're going to drop in a form in the chat, and you can fill out that interest form to get updates if and when mobilizations come together. I'll be real. I wish that there was some extremely exciting, clear action that we could all throw down on that would completely turn the tide. But what is happening to the court right now is so much more big and is so much bigger and more entrenched than I think anything our movement has come up against this far, and one or two big actions isn't going to be enough. And so I think the most important thing that you can do, if you haven't already, is join a Sunrise Hub or organizing group where you are and commit to building power for the long haul. I know that might not sound exciting or easy, and it may not completely match the level of rage or despair that you are feeling, but the long-term commitment and disciplined organizing at a local level is what we need to be doing right now. Going to meetings, linking arms with our neighbors and friends, supporting each other, doing the long work of changing this country from the bottom up. The right got here through 50 years or more of taking over institutions, and we need to be just as ambitious. So if you want to join Sunrise and help us combat that right wing and the right wing and fight for a Green New Deal, fill out the link that you are seeing in the chat right now. It's going to send you to one of our welcome calls, which is the first step to getting involved with the movement. So we're going to close here. I want to leave you with a quote by Rebecca Solnit and she is just a longtime writer, activist, and always has the right words for every moment. And I'm going to just read it to you. Hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. So thank you, everyone. Good night. Stay safe out there and keep that militant optimism. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
I don't know if my video works, but here's a baby bunny that I wanted to share with everybody. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Everyone. Good night. Stay strong. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, folks, I think I'm going to pause the recording and end the call. Thank you everyone so much for coming.